Rich Brockway, and I'm blanking on our third guy.
Craig.
Craig Burdett. So if everybody will just take your seats, they'll go ahead and get started.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. As Jennifer said, my name is Joelle, Loretta, and with me today is Craig Burdett and Richard Brockway. We work here at the IV&V facility, for those of you who do not know us. Today we're going to be talking about our risk-based assessment process and how we scope IV&V work here at the facility, and we're tying in an information assurance perspective with that. So that IT security and information assurance is what this brief is revolved around. Next slide, Jennifer. So the agenda, essentially, we're going to go through some things here, covering information assurance and the three aspects of confidentiality, integrity, and availability that compose that domain. Then we're going to get into how we select projects, and in doing so, we determine the criticality of the projects and the elements and subsystems therein. And we'll get into the specifics of the criterion that we use for impact and likelihood and how we've tailored those to bring in this perspective of IA so that it's more ingrained in the process rather than an afterthought. Then we'll sum it up and just have some acknowledgements at the end. Okay, so basically information assurance, as everybody probably well knows, that it revolves around managing the risks related to systems that either use, process, store, or transmit data, and that's pretty much everything that we have this day and age. So it's a pretty hot topic and a very important aspect to include on anything that deals with IT systems. So NASA's focus, obviously, is to protect its systems, the data that it includes, and we want to do that from all of the threats and risks that are potentially out there. Unfortunately, that landscape is ever evolving. The risks are increasing and the threats are increasing every day. So again, the importance is paramount to include these aspects in everything that we do. We've listed here some common threats, both from an internal and external perspective. Obviously, the internal can be the architecture of the system itself. If it leads itself to ways into the system, then it's obviously open for risk. The developers and users, obviously that can be inherent to as things are developed. Their input is crucial in making sure that the system is secure as well. Some of the external pieces, obviously we have the infamous hackers are out there, and that can be as a result of people wanting to do bad things, espionage and such like that. And the other thing that is somewhat not always considered as natural disasters, and making sure continuity of operations also comes into play there as well. All right, so next I'm going to turn it over to Rich Brockway, who's going to get into more policy and those three aspects of CIA is what we call it, not the branch that we so remain unnamed, but the three specifics there. So going to turn it over to Rich, and he's going to just elaborate on those three terms and how we include those in the perspective.
Yeah, just to briefly set the stage for the rest of the story, despite the risks posed by the threats that Joelle just sort of highlighted, because there are many, regardless of what the mission objective is or what a particular organization faces, what are the protective measures to achieve mission objectives? Because you still have a job to do, you still have a mission to fulfill, and that can't be done in a vacuum. And so the security policy helps define what the assets and information is that you're attempting to protect. And there's really the security triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and what is the trusted system trusted to do. And so that you need a basis or an anchor to establish that. And then we can just briefly go through the next few slides. There's a lot of words on, for example, the next slide. And really what you're trying to do here is, you're trying to, what are the protective measures against unauthorized disclosure of the sensitive information or their credentials to access that information? So if you think of users in the system or those processes that represent user behavior in your business process, you're trying to prevent disclosure of that information or asset. as defined in the security policy. On the next slide and the subsequent slide, there are a lot of words here, and this is really just to show that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, helps drive, particularly for government agencies, what each of these terms mean, but fundamentally for confidentiality, unauthorized disclosure. In this case, unauthorized modification or destruction is for the integrity of the asset or the sensitive information. And then on the next slide is to prevent withholding or disruption of access to the information or the service itself, despite the mission objective. There's typically information in many of the systems that we're faced with to share information. So you want to be able to share. You have to define the asset, share the information with your internal user community, and then certainly make that available to an external community such that it's available, it's the correct information, and that only those that have access to see it can see it and process it. And so the system then will have defined components, or let's say pieces of the system, that have security relevant behavior. And what Craig will do is help us better understand how to scope and identify those components and the security relevant behavior, thus to determine what is the impact or potential impact to these areas of confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
I'm going to take over, and again, for those of you in the room who are IV&V, you're very familiar with the processes that we use to select projects and how we scope the system themselves to identify which pieces to concentrate on, because we're a small group, we're not a cast of thousands, so we can't look at everything. So when we look at ways to select the projects across the board, we need to keep on top of realizing the importance of IA, such that, you know, systems that we've typically done in the past have mostly been flight software related. But as we start to reach out and expand our services to other systems such as ground networks, integrated communication systems and such, IT security tends to pop its head and make itself more prevalent in there. So we need to be you know, due diligence in making sure that we address those systems, because they're important for that perspective with being secure. So this slide here just kind of identifies that the processes that we have, we realized that, you know, they were kind of geared towards the flight software aspects, so we needed to do some tailoring and evolve them such that we keep this perspective and bring it into play, and not just, you know, think of answering the 3 questions. You know, does the software do what it's supposed to do and not do what it's not supposed to do, and so forth, but also, you know, is the system going to be secure as well? So it's just morphing into bringing in these other perspectives. Next slide, Jennifer. Okay, so the current processes that we have, and those are very familiar with the portfolio-based risk assessment and then the risk-based assessment, which essentially is a 2-phase process, to where in the beginning, from a portfolio perspective, we rate each project and each system across the board on the criteria to assess impact and likelihood from a capability perspective. So we look at what each system is supposed to do and rate that of the same criteria across the board. So we can kind of have a map and a playing field of where each project lies, and where, you know, if one is critical and one isn't critical, then we might not put as much staff to that. But it's just a way of normalizing the criticality from a behavior perspective of all projects that we have here at the facility. Now, the next step of that is to rate each system itself and identify where in the system are the most important pieces from a software perspective. So we've identified and have processes that rate the impact and likelihood based on 3 criteria. For the impact, it's personnel safety, performance, and operational software control. And then on the likelihood, there were 4 categories, such as complexity, testability, degree of innovation and development characteristics. So those were the criteria as it stood. So when you look at those, you can probably try to keep IT security or information assurance in the performance perspective, but we felt it was just kind of masking it to some degree. So we wanted to take a look at it and see if we brought made a separate criteria looking specifically how the system and its pieces are contributing to maintaining system security, how that fell out and looked on the risk perspective on a 5x5 essentially. Okay, next slide, Jennifer. So basically this just kind of sums it up. What we did was take our current processes and tailor them to force the IA perspective as a separate criteria. And Craig is going to show how we came up with the elaboration on each of those and how you rate the severity 1 through 5, depending on where we felt it met. And we used the standards as a big driver on that. So everything from the FIPS and the NIST security standards contributed to how we were laying out what those criteria were. All right, Craig,
All right.
you want to go ahead?
Yes, as Joelle mentioned, I'm Craig Burgett. I'm going to talk a little bit just to give you an overview of some of the enhancements we're proposing to our current processes and just to highlight an example of how we're considering implementing these changes and enhancements. And the slide you see now is a bit of an eye chart, and well, the details are probably not as important, at least not for this context. This is an example, and if you want, you can go back and read the details of how we particularly took this, our security criteria, proposed security criteria, to bring in that IA perspective for impact, and broke it down according to the CIA, and across, what you see across the top is from 1 to 5, and increasing severity, the impact from low to almost no impact all the way up to catastrophic on a 5. And then there's a top row has got a general explanation that pretty much follows the NIST guidance and the explanation from FIPS 199. And then we take the further elaboration is a breakdown of I think it was the NIST 860, I believe, and putting that in terms that relate specifically in our case to the IV&V program here and in the NASA context, and uses terms that would be familiar to the analyst on our program. However, the same thing could be done for any other IV&V program. And then this is, if you go back and take a look at this and want to get into the details, you can see how it maps to what Rich was explaining earlier. All these things are available in this guidance and are out there in the public domain. Anyhow, so that's just sort of how we chose to approach that. So there's a further elaboration, which I won't get all the details under each of those numbers, so the analyst can look and decide how their particular capability they're looking at or function within the system would score along this scale, and then make an estimate and pick one. And then on the next slide, we'll see how it factors in against the existing factors and criteria that we have in the current algorithm. It sort of breaks down the impact algorithm and where we inserted security, or that you see on there, the SEC represents the security factor. So the analyst uses that chart on the previous page to determine where whatever they're examining or analyzing fits the number and plugs it in there to calculate it against the other factors. Now, in this case, we chose to put it in as a factor for the max function because it's independent of the other factors in the sense that it represents the particular IA perspective and expresses impact in IA terms. And so if you're looking at a function or a capability of your mission or system and comparing it against the other factors, if it doesn't have a high score for security impact, if it doesn't have things that it would contribute to a higher security impact, it will drop out and not influence the score like if it was an average or something like that. So anyhow, so that just to illustrate how we're factoring security in, have it rise to the surface when it needs to, if it becomes important in relationship to that particular component, or drop out if it is not important. Next slide. Similar, we have a matrix for likelihood. the existing criteria Joelle's already gone over. I won't spend a lot of time here. It's very, very similar where you've got we're calling it security posture. The one point I'll make about the security posture factor is that there are a number of ways to think of likelihood. Normally, we would think of likelihood when we're looking at a particular component, and the likelihood of a failure occurring in that component. In the case of security, there's actually another dimension to consider, and that's the controls that exist outside of that component to the system as a whole. I did in the previous slide fail to mention that one of the things that makes the IA perspective unique is that the impacts are generally expressed in system terms. We might have been looking at, okay, if a failure happened, the performance of that particular function, what happens when that drops out. However, a failure from the security perspective would be a vulnerability existing in that particular function. And that might mean an impact far beyond that particular capability. So that's one of the reasons that it's important to consider the security separately, because the impacts are really come and expressed differently than it would be for some of the other factors. Same for the likelihood. Likelihood of an occurrence of a particular failure is one perspective, but then you also have the likelihood of exploit, where a threat has to combine with an opportunity and that vulnerability, and to make that impact happen. So our security posture criteria considers all those levels: the likelihood of a failure, which means vulnerability in that component, plus a threat and a way to exploit that particular vulnerability, and the likelihood that all those things will come together to create the impact. And then that in turn it combines with impact in the same way it combines now. We're not going to change that part of it. There's a further analysis that happens when we matrix these two scores together, but this is just, we're focusing here just on how we're enhancing the scoring on the likelihood and impact dimensions. All right, so next page, and I'll just explore briefly our change we're proposing to the likelihood algorithm. Again, it's a maximum, and where the others are average. The others categories, the existing likelihood categories, are expressing mostly the term of failure happening within that component. In this case, we have a combined scoring that we do, and we consider the likelihood of exploit and occurrence of a vulnerability together, and come up with a single number. If it rises up, it will exceed then, of course, the likelihood of an internal failure. However, if it's not that much of a factor, then the current likelihood score overrides or is maintained, and security drops out. So that pretty much covers that.
Okay. Well, that's pretty much all that we had in there. Again, we just, the main points of this was to show that by tailoring our current processes and making this criterion for security a distinct entity, rather than trying to merge it in with some of our existing criteria, it forces the perspective to make the analyst to look, all right, this thing has to perform in this way. Does it have to be secure, and is it doing it? So it just forces that look, so that you don't come in later with a Band-Aid and say, oh shoot, we should have looked at it from a security perspective. So it's just all but improving our processes to make sure that we keep that domain at the forefront, because the needs are ever arising with that. So in doing that, we obviously add more rigor to our current processes to include this perspective. And we're also following suit with some of the current, industry practices. I mean, all systems are going this way, so we need to follow suit. So, and I think we're doing a good job of trying to come into play with that. All right. Any questions so far?
Fine. C.G. Gilson asks, does time affect impact? For example, users may be able to accept a day of loss, but 2 days causes missed milestone. Is that considered a greater impact?
Could you repeat that one more time, please?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Does time affect impact? For example, users may be able to accept a day of loss, but 2 days causes a missed milestone. Is that considered a greater impact?
Well, to me, it'd have to be on what the requirements are, right? If the availability requirements allow for that, then, you know, there's a little bit more leeway there. But I think it certainly does. It all depends on what the system has to do.
Thank you. I have another question online. Is this an adaptation of what NASA IV&V used to call their CARA methodology for risk assessment?
I'm gonna divert that to someone who's been here longer than me. I'll look at Don Oe since he's back there. But the PBRA, RBA, there is a history there on with the CARA on how things were scoped back then. But I'm not willing to say that it's, you know, such that as it once was.
It should be on.
Okay, so I guess the way I would answer that is it's not a direct extension.
Is it on?
Closer to the mic.
You want mine?
He's still closer, I think.
Okay, all right. I got it. So I would say it's not a direct extension of CARA. CARA was something that we used in the past here. Our current analogous thing is called PBRA, and that is what we are augmenting with security factors. So the answer is kind of yes, but not exactly. It's an augmentation of PBRA, which plays the role that CARA played in the past.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Hey, this is very similar to what we do use in my field. I'm out of the pharmaceutical medical device, except we put in a detectability into this as far as the amount of time it might take a patient to realize that something is wrong. So in addition to the likelihood and impact, sometimes we will put that detectability in. But I guess my question is, this is from a system perspective. Do you ever break it down into a requirements or features perspective? Because we do that as well in our field, where we might take those key requirements and bring it through a risk assessment so we know how much script to test out and what to emphasize in our testing.
Yes and no, right? Because from a process perspective, no, we don't really do this per requirement. But as we, you know, look to see from a system perspective how things they've identified from the requirements, because on the categorization of the system and how those decompose, and does that flow into literal requirements, and are those, we do such analysis as we do on any other requirement, but, you know, is the quality there, is it correct, is it complete, and so forth. So in essence, yes, but we don't rate each requirement from this perspective. Once it's identified and correct as a system requirement, we follow suit with the regular requirements type analysis that we do and follow that all the way in through test.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, we have, yes.
Does that make sense?
We have
Okay.
a system risk assessment tool, again, that's similar, but what we also have is what we call a functional risk assessment tool, and that's where we'll take a specific requirement or a specific feature and drag it through as well.
Yeah,
We don't do it all the time. It's
Okay.
only in certain instances with certain systems as well. But I was just curious if that was
Okay.
something that was looked into.
We are trying to bring the IA perspective into other areas, specifically in the methods that we use as well. And I think that's sort of where you're going with that. I think the scope of this particular presentation was on the RBA process that we have or had in place and how we're augmenting it. But there's other things, and Joelle could speak to that too.
Right.
Going on to our enhancing methods that are applied at various, you know, in various phases.
And those follow suit with the life cycle as well. And actually, it follows with the risk management framework from NIST. So
And you're still mainly waterfall? Or are you going into agile?
we're following whatever the developer
Whatever the
does.
developer
does.
Unfortunately, we don't
Okay.
dictate
Just
what our
curious,
process
because
is.
agile is very much on the rise.
Yeah.
And so
Understand.
sneak that in there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We do still have some time, so we're going to take a couple more questions.
You mentioned the degree of innovation as something that needs to be considered, and then later you actually compare some value of that with other attributes. Could you say a little bit about how you quantify that and how you normalize that scale for purposes of comparing?
Okay, well, degree of innovation is in our current process, right? And so it takes into consideration like technology readiness levels of certain components that are in there. You know, obviously, is it reuse or something to that effect? So that all plays into how that's rated. But the way that we in the likelihood we defined and added the security posture in there was kind of like an outsider, because currently each of those attributes are averaged in the current process. So what we wanted to do was bring the security aspect outside of all of those such that it doesn't just get averaged in, because you know certain things can define likelihood, but it's very difficult from an IA perspective, and we found that to be true. It's hard to assess likelihood when you're trying to figure out if the vulnerability is there, okay, is it likely to be exploited? Those are, you know, two different beasts in itself. But, you know, some things that we try to consider, and if you look into the elaboration of the criteria that we have included in the back of the slides for security posture, some of the things are, do they have a security plan, right? Are they following the recommended guidance for the categorization of the system? Do they have the controls defined? And so one hopes to see that up front in the beginning of the program, so that those things, you know, feed into your comfort level of, are they going to get there or not?
Yeah, I guess it's clear even to someone like me that that's all important stuff, but you've also somehow mapped it into a number. That's the part that sort of caught my eye.
The number as far as the ratings go on how, like,
yeah,
and those follow with our current process, right? We try to rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 such that it sort of mimics a risk 5x5 matrix. Okay, so that's why those numbers are the way that they are.
Yeah, but you still then compare them with different 1 by 5. I mean, you're comparing constructed scales somehow. It just seems a lot of thought must have gone into that. I guess that's all.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, and it's still
We'll take
I'm going to say this right, quantitative analysis. I mean, we put numbers on it. It's kind of to help standardize it a little bit and make it a little easier to compare, but you still have to be cognizant of that normalization. And if you're getting results that look a little out of, you know, like if suddenly something jumps up from the bottom that you wouldn't expect to and jumps over the line, and it's worth looking into, because there's subjectivity here, and things could be still, you know, go off the mark if you're not careful. So if there's something out of the ordinary, definitely go back and take a look at it again and try to run it, because you do have to be cognizant that people could look at it differently, rate it differently, and then you can come up with skewed results if you're not careful.
Right, it's important to know, you know, we're still hashing this out, and it's, you know, we're learning as we go, and we're trying to make it better as we go, but it, you know, it's just one that's it's gonna morph over time, so we're still trying to hash out all the specifics, but we're at least starting, and I mean, that's a good thing.
Yes, we have time for one more question.
Okay, I noticed in your selection criteria you have operational scenarios listed. And I'm curious if you guys have considered if there's any thoughts of development scenarios. I know just the background of that is I'm working on the ground systems for KSC, and they've actually asked us to look at some of the development tools and not just their, you know, the artifacts of what they're generating. And I'm wondering if that's part of your, or maybe I just missed it when I was when you guys were talking, if that's part of this, or you're thinking of including that in your scope. In other words, in other words, the security assurance of their development environment, not the resulting system, because it seems to me it's your resulting system is only secure as your development, because there could be some sort of, you know, who knows what, you know, corruption or and so on. And I'm wondering if you're thinking of including that in your scope.
It's definitely a good idea. I mean, I think, you know, some of that, as far as like the development characteristics, we could perhaps consider elaboration in those as well, but, you know, we haven't made that a distinctive or a separate elaboration as of yet. But yeah, we'll definitely keep that in mind. That goes back to the first slide where it said, you know, the users and the insider threats, right, is how they're developing it. They could inherently code in some way in. Thank you. Is that all? All right. Thank you. Also wanted to just, the last slide, we had some acknowledgments in there for some folks that have been instrumental in helping us with this. Brandon Bailey, who's one of our CD initiative leads on information assurance, and then Roger Harris, the SGSS program project manager on our side, and the rest of our SGSS team. And that's, I failed to mention in the beginning, that's the project that Craig and I are currently working on. It's the ground segment of the space communication network. All right. Thank you.